It's my nerd world, and welcome to it. The Star Wars Reporter. On the show this week, we're going to talk about Star Wars stuff. You want to know why? Because I like Star Wars stuff. That's why. A lot of details coming out about the book of Boba Fett. Not from official sources, but the information sounds official enough. So I'll share that with you. Taika Waititi comments on how he hopes to be doing Star Wars after the project he's currently working on. I will share with you the many plans that Lucas had for his Star Wars films and how it relates to the current and somewhat consistent criticism the sequel trilogy has received. Plus, we'll get to your listener feedback. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com is the email address. The Star Wars Reporter this week is brought to you by Enso Rings. Enso Rings is an industry leader in silicone rings, and they've teamed up with Star Wars to make some amazing rings that, trust me, I've got the entire set. They are instant collector's items. ENSORings.com is the website, and I'll have more details to share with you and some special deals coming up a little bit later on in the show this week.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My nerd world.
Just let it in.
It is the Star Wars Reporter here on My Nerd World, and I'm your host, Jon Justice. Glad you're with the show. Again, this week, we've got quite a bit of ground to cover. I want to mention, too, the show is brought to you by Enso Rings. And we will give you more details about how you can pick up these amazing collector's items a little bit later on in the show. Also, mynerdworld.net and the EMBARK science fiction book series written by me, Jon Justice. I encourage you to go check that out at Amazon.com. Look for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK. Great for all ages, right? Written for adults, but perfectly fine for kids 11 and up to read as well. And you can go to mynerdworld.net for more details about that. All right, before we get into some of the news this week, let's start off with a little bit of talk about Bad Batch. Again, not going to spend a lot of time getting into the storyline of the show. It is a show that I'm very much enjoying. I feel like it lost a little bit for me personally, right? I still have been enjoying every single episode, but they started off that series on such a high note with that combination of a couple of episodes with that long 70-minute, right? Episode 1 and 2. We're into sort of more of the formulaic storytelling that Disney and Lucasfilm does, and this was especially indicative when it comes to The Mandalorian. And as a matter of fact, not necessarily a complaint, but, my wife pointed it out that, with The Mandalorian, it really is set up like a video game. Every single episode, they have to accomplish some challenge and then move forward. And I know that it's the nature of episodic storytelling, but that does lead to those filler, doing that thing with my fingers, episodes that still provide valuable information for the larger A-plot story going on, but at the end of the day, really, it is about just a secondary sort of B-plot that doesn't matter nearly as much to the overall storytelling. So I feel like the last few episodes of The Bad Batch has been like that. But again, it's Star Wars. Really, really am enjoying the series. And I guess probably more importantly for me personally, while I'm loving The Bad Batch, and I know we're going to get a lot more live action stuff, right? I know there's going to be a point in time when I sit down to do this show and I'm going to be, sort of scratching my head going, where do I start? Because we're going to have so much content to be able to discuss. So right now, with my presence in the here and now, I really want more live action Star Wars, especially with having watched now WandaVision, Falcon and Winter Soldier, and Loki starting up. I I hope that Disney is able to pump out these projects in such a way where we get that type of consistency on the streaming platform, right? And this is filling in the gap for the movies, which is ultimately what I would want to see more than anything else, would be the theatrical releases. And this is coming off like I'm being just a petty sort of complaining Star Wars fan, and I'm not. It's just that I'm really enjoying the Marvel live-action shows, and just because I love Star Wars so much, I want those Star Wars live-action shows. You know, and I know Disney has a plan, and that we have, again, a lot of this coming. I just feel like there's these gaps right now. And this kind of points back towards something that I've talked about in the last few episodes, and that is my desire that Disney would feed us in more of the hardcore fandom and the casual fandom, some tiny details of these future projects from official sources. I love the Bad Batch. It really is filling in the gap in light of not having any other Star Wars or theatrical releases coming out. And it really just makes me want more live-action Star Wars at the moment, and I guess I'm jealous of Marvel. That's really what it comes down to. I am jealous that Marvel has done 3 live-action series in a year, and we're essentially only getting Bad Batch. I'm jealous of that. All right, let's go ahead and move on to some of the news items for this week.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So there's a lot of sort of random tidbits coming out about the Obi-Wan Kenobi limited series, or I guess singular series. It's filming right now. There's been some photographs taken of Ewan McGregor, but whatever he's wearing is covered up in black robes, so he's not exposing on set where people are getting these behind-the-scene shots. There was an interview that Ewan McGregor did with Pedro Pascal, and there's been some back and forth between those that are kind of in the know of Star Wars production and what's coming from Pedro Pascal, because Pedro Pascal, who plays the Mandalorian in The Mandalorian, told Ewan McGregor that they hadn't started filming yet, and yet there are several different sources online and on Twitter who have been reliable in the past who have said that, well, no, The Mandalorian really has been filming, and it's the middle ground here that will point to, that may explain all of this, coming from Collider. So they had an article talking about the Book of Boba Fett, and the most interesting details are this. The Book of Boba Fett will be a more closely linked spin-off, as well as a spin-off series, right, to The Mandalorian. And sources have told Collider to think of the Book of Boba Fett as more of the Mandalorian Season 2.5, with characters from The Mandalorian slated to appear in the series that currently co-stars Ming-Na Wen as Fennec Shand. However, Season 3 of The Mandalorian is not currently heading into production, and that's because the LA stages are, for the moment, in use for the Star Wars Obi-Wan Kenobi limited series, right? That show was set 10 years after the event of that film being Revenge of the Sith in 2005, and production on that series will reportedly take many months. They're also hearing that the plan is for The Mandalorian Season 3 to begin filming at the end of the year or in very early 2022. What that means is the season will probably not be premiering on Disney Plus until late 2022. So it sounds like those insiders might be pointing to the fact that The Mandalorian has been involved in the Book of Boba Fett series, and therefore any information that they received about the Mandalorian character in and of himself filming could have been directly taken as, oh, he's filming Mandalorian Season 3, when in reality it was a Mandalorian appearing in the Book of Boba Fett. Just shooting from the hip here, right? No, I have no information about this. This is just a thought that popped off in my head. I can't help but wonder if the distance in The Mandalorian Season 3 and The Mandalorian's appearance in the Book of Boba Fett Season 2.5 might actually benefit The Mandalorian in as much as I think a lot of people are going to want to see, and Disney is going to want to do, or Disney is going to want to bring back Grogu. I think that's kind of a given, right? Given how popular that character ended up becoming, right? Whether they had expected that or didn't expect that, it happened. And a Mandalorian Season 3 without Grogu in some way, I'm sure it can work. I know I'll watch it, but at the same time, something tells me that that is certainly not the last we've seen of Grogu. And it's interesting, too, because this is going to play in to some older details from the George Lucas era about his plans overall for all of the films that he was creating and how things changed quite a bit. And decisions were made that were much different than what we ended up seeing on screen. It makes sense to me that perhaps they didn't plan on having Grogu coming back when those first couple of seasons were written for The Mandalorian, but now they're going to change plans based off the fact of how popular that character has become. So the reason I bring it up is because that makes sense now to have The Mandalorian in a more prominent role than we would have expected for the Book of Boba Fett. This way you do get kind of a Mandalorian Season 2.5 with these other characters that we've been introduced to, but it's attached to a separate show from The Mandalorian, so there would be less, right, of an expectation for the character Grogu to be on that show, and he wouldn't be missed nearly as much because the expectation would be, well, this is the Book of Boba Fett and not The Mandalorian. And then by the time we get to The Mandalorian, we'll have some distance in terms of the storytelling timeline, in which case a return of Grogu might make better storytelling sense than him being off with Luke Skywalker and, suddenly now he's left without having completed his training or having trained very much at all. And the other thing to add to this is what Kathleen Kennedy said. She talked about the continued storytelling of The Mandalorian before we got the information of the Book of Boba Fett. So I think that kind of reinforces the idea that the Book of Boba Fett is a quasi-Mandalorian Season 2.5. But Kathleen Kennedy also talked about how these shows, including Ahsoka, and I thought Rangers of the New Republic, even though that's been kind of set to the side, were all going to culminate into one bigger event, whether that was like a movie-sized event on the Disney Plus streaming platform, or even, as some people have speculated, maybe a theatrical release, right? But that all of these different shows are going to interconnect to culminate into one bigger story. Again, I can't imagine that bigger story being attached to The Mandalorian, and how important Grogu was wouldn't include that particular character. And it also makes sense that we're going to have several of the characters in The Mandalorian, including The Mandalorian himself, appearing in the Book of Boba Fett show. All right, let's move on to the next item. It is also Book of Boba Fett related, and we'll talk about the man who actually plays the character of Boba Fett, along with Jango and many clones in the theatrical movies. That would be Tamira Morrison. So Tamira Morrison, who was being interviewed by Rotten Tomatoes, had a couple of comments about the Book of Boba Fett, and he says this, that there, or at least it sounds like based off of what he said, there's going to be flashbacks in the show. And he says, well, I can't say too much, but we're going to see his past, being Boba Fett's, and where he's been since The Empire Strikes Back. Somebody pointed out that he's been kind of stuck in one place, and now's the time to actually go back in time and check out his journey and find out more about him. He also says that Robert Rodriguez did direct a few of the episodes, and that they had some wonderful other directors as well. And I failed to mention last week, because it actually relates to this, when I was talking about Kira returning in the War of the Bounty Hunters comic book series. What I failed to mention was the reason why she returned, and that's because the story, I believe, takes place between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and the story is actually how Boba Fett lost the frozen Han Solo in carbonite, had it stolen from him, and it was actually Kira who was the one who stole it. And Boba Fett has to go and get it back because Han's beginning to thaw, and if it thaws, Han will die. I kind of buried the lead based off of my my rant last week about Kira returning in the comic book series and what it could mean potentially for a live action show. But that was the context, which I thought was really interesting. I mean, that's a really big deal, and for something to cover inside of the comic book, I thought was inside of a comic book was really interesting. This idea that Kira actually stole a frozen in carbonite Han Solo from Boba Fett, and he has to go and get it back. That's something I actually kind of wish they would have saved for maybe a flashback, like Tamira Morrison was talking about in that interview that he did with Rotten Tomatoes. So interesting nonetheless. All right, one more news item, and then we'll dive into a little bit of commentary this week. And this is talking about Lucas's long ago plans for 7, 8, and 9. But the last item we have here comes from Taika Waititi, and it's not a big one, right? Thor Ragnarok, director, What We Do in the Shadows. A couple of episodes on season 1 of the Mandalorian, including still my favorite episode of the Mandalorian, and that would be the season finale of season 1 that he directed. But it seems that Taika will film his Star Wars movie. When he's going to film his Star Wars movie is still up in the air. The quote from the article says, Taika Waititi expects to be in post-producing Thor, Love and Thunder until February. Then he will finish up some television projects and move on to his next movie. He said, I don't know if that's going to be Star Wars. He says, I hope it'll be that, but there's a whole lot of other things that I've got my sticky little fingers attached to, so we'll see. And again, this I'm going to bring it back around to that thing at the moment that I keep mentioning, and I really, and I'm sure there's a reason for it, but man, I really would like to know just what is that time period of the Taika Waititi film? Is it potentially going to be attached to a larger story? I just think that Disney and Lucasfilm are so gun-shy over putting too much out because they've had to backtrack on so much stuff. I still remember the day when they announced that Benioff and Weiss from Game of Thrones were going to be doing a series of films, and that ended up falling by the wayside. Of course, we had the announcement of Rian Johnson doing a trilogy for Star Wars, and apparently that is still potentially out there lurking, And then in the meantime, we get this oddball one of the 2023 Rogue Squadron film, which maybe I haven't mentioned this on the show, but that one still is a head scratcher for me. It's a head scratcher for me, not because I'm not looking forward to it, but just because, at least on its face, and I guess it'll remain to be seen if I'm right or wrong about this. I mean, this seems like a Rogue One type of film, and that's not to say that Rogue One isn't beloved and wasn't a great movie, but with such a big gap, right? This is going to be the biggest Disney era gap that we've had for the release of a film. It just seems like a weird one to come out of the gate with. Like, I mean, as opposed to coming out with like a bold, brave, epic, because I imagine it's going to be Taika Waititi Star Wars film. We're going to come out with this Rogue One movie, which might be big, bold, and brave and epic. It doesn't sound that way so far, but then again, we don't really know that much about it. So, what do you think? All right, what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. As always, leave a comment up on YouTube as well. I'm just very, very curious about not just all things Star Wars that are going into production, but especially that Taika Waititi project, because that one to me has the most fun and the biggest question mark on it, and I would just love to know, like I said, just what even time period it's going to take place in. And something tells me we're not going to end up finding out for quite a long time. All right, let's get to George Lucas's plans long ago for all of his films.
This is not going to go the way you think.
So I found this lengthy article, and I've just grabbed the most relevant portions of it to make a broader point. So before I share this with you, I want to tell you about an observation that I had last night, which I thought was interesting. Just another one of those instances where I'm watching a movie that I've seen hundreds of times, and yet there's little tiny things that I start pulling from it. So I was watching The Empire Strikes Back yesterday, and visual cues from that film and the original trilogy as a whole that ended up appearing in the sequel trilogy. All of which leads me to believe, as I've said before, that I think once we have some distance on these sequel films, they're going to be regarded and received better than they are now, especially in the in the larger Star Wars context of the three trilogies, because there really are some cool visual cues that the sequels had taken directly from the original trilogy, and maybe there are things in the original trilogy I'm so used to seeing, but when I see them in the sequel trilogy, they kind of, I don't want to say they're jarring, but it seems like that's the first time it's done, and it really hasn't. So on a bad example part of it, watching The Empire Strikes Back, there were several shots of just the Imperial fleet out in space, moving around leading up to a particular scene. And watching it, the thing that popped into my head was The Last Jedi. And the numerous shots that Rian Johnson gave to us of the First Order fleet, whether when they were arriving on Dakar at the beginning of the film or during the chase through space. There were just a lot of shots in The Empire Strikes Back of just the fleet sitting there in space or moving through space that I felt were paid tribute to, or at least, sort of the way the shots were captured were very similar to what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi. On a more sort of specific note, the Darkside cave on Dagobah and Luke's coming face to face with Vader. Several things in that particular scene I thought were interesting, especially as it relates to the rise of Skywalker. There were several slow motion shots. Like if you had asked me before the sequel trilogy, and maybe had some distance on me watching the films by a couple of weeks and said, are there any slow motion shots in Star Wars? I probably would say, the top of my head, go no, but I'd be wrong. There's several dynamic shots, right? Especially in that Darkside cave on Dagobah. And it reminded me of Rey's encounter with her dark side self on the Death Star 2 wreckage in The Rise of Skywalker. Specifically sort of the mirroring of the two scenes. As a matter of fact, even when Vader walks into the cave, when Luke's vision of Vader as he walks into the dark side cave and the way the walls are curved, it immediately made me think of the room that Rey walked into on the Death Star 2 wreckage. But you do have several slow motion shots in that dark side cave scene on Dagobah in The Empire Strikes Back with Luke. Reminds me of when Rey comes back to life at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. And if you notice, there's a slight effect on her hand as the first thing that you see as she reaches for Kylo Ren. And look, there's a ton of different shots and homages. And I'll give you one more. Vader's chambers in The Empire Strikes Back. Very, very much shown as sort of I'm wording this reversely. Kylo Ren's chambers on his Star Destroyer in The Empire Strikes Back are similar to Vader's chamber that he sits in on his Star Destroyer in The Empire Strikes Back. And specifically I'm talking about the white. It's one of the things in The Rise of Skywalker that I thought was a little bit odd, that Kylo Ren's chamber would be all white the way that it is, but watching The Empire Strikes Back and actually seeing what Vader is in with his chamber that opens and closes, again, I'm like, oh no, this is lifted from Ralph McQuarrie art and taken actually from these other films. So again, I bring all this up as just examples of how I do believe that when we get some distance on these films, they're going to be better received than they are now. On top of that, looking at the 3-story arc of the sequel trilogy, removing the context of the previous films. So let's say, for just the sake of argument, that episodes 7, 8, 9 existed by themselves and there weren't any other movies. It's a really unique story and a really interesting story. And while it's obviously drawn upon the myths and legends of our past, certainly that was something that George Lucas pulled upon, it really is a different and unique tale set apart from most of the science fiction fare and fantasy fare that you see. And it's one of the things that, in my opinion, makes Star Wars so great, is that it has this push and pull and this balance between the fantasy element and the science fiction element. As a matter of fact, I was reading a thread on Facebook, and it was in a science fiction publishing thread, I believe. And some people were arguing whether or not Star Wars was actually science fiction. And people were making both, and not straight up fantasy. And I believe it's science fiction fantasy. It's a good combination of both. But it really is a fresh and unique story, even if it has its fair share of homages. But when viewed through a lens of just those stories, it's at both times familiar and fresh. And here's a comparison for you. The wife and I just got done binge watching Sweet Tooth, the series on Netflix, and both really enjoyed it. She loved it. She absolutely loved it. And I really enjoyed it too. But and I won't spoil anything. I'll just say that the story is kind of Planet of the Apes with a twist. I didn't notice it until the end of the series, and I kind of picked up on the story beat elements and how they are very similar to those in Planet of the Apes. But while I was watching that, I was like, oh, okay, well, that's a lot of sort of storytelling that's from that other franchise. So that's rather interesting. And comparing that to what we get in almost all of the Star Wars films, where, again, you have your homage to past storytelling and mythology, they really are unique and fresh and different stories. And the sequel trilogy is just that. That A plot of Rey finding herself, Kylo Ren finding himself, and where they end up in The Rise of Skywalker is really a cool and unique story. And again, at both times familiar, but also fresh, right? It doesn't feel like it's something that you necessarily have seen that much, apart from, like many Reylos have called, have pointed to, like your Pride and Prejudice. But even then, it separates itself out in its own storytelling to, again, feel familiar and also fresh. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com is the email address. If you have any comments for the show, you can also leave a comment up on YouTube as well. Before we get into Lucas's long ago plans for 6, 7, 8, and 9, I want to talk just briefly about something that I found that I'm wearing right now and that every Star Wars fan needs to have. I like those unique Star Wars items, right? I love my t-shirts and I love my Star Wars hats, but I like those items that are, kind of off to the side, something you wouldn't expect to be able to go and express your Star Wars fandom. Like for a side example, I have this amazing wallet that has the Rebel symbol, the Rebel emblem on it, right, in metal, and it's just subtle enough to where if it's out sitting somewhere and somebody sees it, they go, "Oh, hey, you're a Star Wars fan." Look, I found something like that. It's truly unique and special, and I want to tell you about it. It's from Enzo Rings. Enzo Rings is the industry leader in silicone rings, and they've teamed up with Star Wars to make these amazing rings that I'm telling you, they are instant collector's items. You've got to check these out. And these are perfect. These are the perfect gift for Father's Day or any Star Wars fan in your life. Now, I have the entire set, and I've got it right here in my hands, and it comes in a really cool collectible box. And inside, you're going to find appropriately colored and accurately created images of these characters. You got R2-D2 in the signature blue. You've got C-3PO in the gold. You've got Grogu in the green. You've got a Mandalorian in a gray. I got Darth Vader in black, which is awesome. And the one I'm wearing right now is actually a silver stormtrooper. This is really a fun and unique way to share your Star Wars fandom But also find that perfect gift for the father in your life or that Star Wars fan in your life. Now, the rings from Enzo Rings are high quality, 100% silicone, and they're made right here in the USA in their facility in Utah. And again, they're perfect for wearing as a high quality wedding ring replacement, a fashion accessory, or just like me to show off your love of Star Wars. So the Star Wars collection from Enzo Rings, again, 6 rings that represent a particular character. And as I mentioned, the Mandalorian, Vader, Grogu, R2-D2, C-3PO, and a Stormtrooper, all in this amazing limited edition collection box. So don't wait. Order your Enzo Rings today for the Star Wars fan in your life, including yourself. And go to enzorings.com. That's ENSO rings.com. And you're going to get free shipping with the code Star Wars. Again, that's enzorings.com and use that promo code Star Wars.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
So, George Lucas had rough ideas for his films, including the movies that he would never go and produce. And that would be episodes 7, 8, and 9. And you even have sort of an initial draft for 9 that Lucas had. And I have an article here in front of me, and I'll share with you what they wrote. And it says this: before we get into Lucas's initial draft for episode 9, we have to examine his original plan for the remainder of the classic trilogy. Per Howard Kurtz, The Empire Strikes Back was more or less what we eventually got, with only minor sequences that had no real bearing on a plot that was cut out, right? Again, I pulled from a really lengthy article just for the relevant things that I wanted to get into about how Lucas has even changed his plans when he was making his films. Return of the Jedi was a completely different animal. Among the key developments in Lucas's first draft for Episode 6 were Leia being elected as Queen of her people, Han Solo dying, and Luke living alone after battling Darth Vader. It goes without saying that a lot changed in the 3 years between Empire and Jedi, with Lucas restructuring the movie to serve as the finale of the trilogy with a more upbeat conclusion. He infamously clashed with Kurtz over the new direction of the film, which led to a falling out between the two of them, according to this article. If Lucas had stayed on his initial path, Episode 9 would have marked the first appearance of the Emperor. Palpatine made his big screen debut during a hologram sequence in The Empire Strikes Back, but Lucas had initially saved the ultimate reveal for the very, very end. In a way, this makes a lot of sense. The Emperor was always the big bad of Star Wars, so only his downfall could bring the story to its proper resolution. Now, again, the details about what Lucas had in mind are slim, particularly because things went in a drastically different way. But based off of what we know, the story would likely have involved Luke and his sister teaming up to take down the Emperor together, kind of like what we ended up getting in Dark Empire. It wouldn't have been out of the question for one of the siblings to have been tempted by the dark side, adding some drama and intrigue to the proceedings. It should be noted that at various parts in history, Lucas developed a number of varying concepts for a theoretical Star Wars sequel trilogy. Obviously, once Return of the Jedi came out, his original plan could no longer happen. Han Solo was very much alive, Darth Vader and the Emperor had been defeated, and Leia was revealed to be Luke's sister. So, Lucas had to come up with something new. He actually spent quite a bit of time working on outlines for episodes 7, 8, and 9 prior to Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm. Kathleen Kennedy, as you well know, scrapped those ideas in favor of what we got. And while fans will never get to see Lucas's sequel trilogy, some of the story beats he was planning have been revealed since then. So, Mark Hamill has stated in the past that in the Lucas outlines, Luke trained Leia in the ways of the Force, and again, something that we kind of saw in The Rise of Skywalker that doesn't get enough attention because that scene is so awesome. That flashback scene is so great. I can't wait for the day when people have enough time to get away from their headcanon and revisit The Rise of Skywalker. And I know there's going to be a group of individuals that are going to really end up loving that film more than they do now. We've seen it happen with almost all of the other movies. There's just a lot of great stuff in that film. All right, back to this article. He never got Mark Hamill. He never got into greater specifics of what that might have entailed of Luke training Leia in the ways of the Force. But it would have been fascinating to see the twins working together in that capacity. Again, something that we saw slightly for a minute or two in The Rise of Skywalker. Official Star Wars canon has indicated Leia received minor lessons from Luke in regards to her Force abilities, but she never became a full-fledged Jedi Knight. Leia's areas of concentration were always politics and leadership. Especially with the rise of the First Order, she didn't have time to completely dedicate herself to Luke's teachings. If Lucas had his ideas remained intact, it sounds like Leia would have followed her brother's footsteps and helped establish a new order. Given the tease in Return of the Jedi, Luke saying in time, you'll learn to use it as I have, this would have been the natural continuation for Leia's individual story and allowed her to reach her full potential as a Force user. As it stands, fans were only treated to snippets, and that's the most they'll ever be seen on screen, at least according to what the article is saying, but who knows, anything's possible. After bidding farewell to Han Solo in The Force Awakens, Star Wars fans had to say goodbye to another trilogy hero in The Last Jedi, the article goes on to say. At the end of the film, Luke sacrifices himself so the surviving members of the Resistance can escape, igniting a spark of hope throughout the galaxy. It was an epic and fitting send-off for Skywalker, but per Lucas's original drafts, his death wasn't supposed to happen until the final movie after he trained Leia. This was another revelation from Hamill, who again did not share much beyond the fact that Luke was initially going to die in Star Wars Episode 9. It seems pretty clear, right? And we've been told this in a number of different ways that the writers for Kasdan, Terrio, JJ, Rian Johnson, they absolutely ended up creating their own stories. But they were clearly taking some ideas and elements that either were natural progressions that Lucas was taking or directly George Lucas's ideas. And George Lucas changed his ideas often and a lot. We have the divisions in the fandom because we have the ability to divide ourselves better than we ever have at any moment in our history because of how we go and consume different portions of the fandom and social networking and the internet. Truth of the matter is, the way that these films have been made has been pretty consistent from the get-go. The prequel trilogy is the outlier, having George Lucas gone and directing all of those, and while he crafted stories to tell, while he kind of crafted the narrative to tell the story of the fall of Anakin Skywalker in the prequel trilogy, and that's pretty straightforward, right? When you look at the sequel trilogy and what's happened with, originally in the original trilogy, those were very much ever-evolving and changing stories, as most storytelling is. I'm in the process of writing book 6 in my EMBARK series, and I was all set to have a character go a particular way and to be set up to tell a very specific story in book 7 of my series. And right at the end of writing 6, I've decided to deviate from that, and I've got a different idea. An idea I like more, even though I'm not sure if it's a better idea. It's an idea that I'm more excited to go and write, and that's just a part of how the process works. And I did something I don't normally do. I actually plotted things out and actually mapped out how that story was going to go. So things change. And every filmmaker and every studio has a different way of crafting and telling their stories. Unfortunately, we just have more access to how that process works more than ever. And large portions of the fandom like to grab onto that and use it as a means to justify the complaints that they have, which are legitimate because art is subjective. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. You can also leave a comment on YouTube as well. All right, before we go, let's get to just a few items in listener feedback this week.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
So Brian Martin, a friend of the show, asked a really quick question. Why do you think people have a problem with identity politics being in Star Wars? Look, I'll make it simple. I think people just like to be able to complain about Star Wars. And it goes back to what I said, sort of before. A lot of people take things within the films and different viewpoints and narratives, and they use it to sort of justify why they don't like something that they wish they could like. I'm not a fan of identity politics. I don't want to see identity politics in my Star Wars. I don't think that it's been that bad, honestly. I think a lot of the complaints about identity politics in Star Wars is somewhat overblown, unless we're talking about things that are happening outside of the actual storytelling, of which I don't want to get into right now because I've covered it before on the show. I think ultimately the real answer to your question there is people just don't like politics in Star Wars. And people don't like outside real world politics in Star Wars. I know there's always been politics in Star Wars, and George has made political statements in his films, but they've always been done in the narrative sense from the viewpoint of this is taking place in a galaxy far, far away. A long time ago, so I can get past whatever George might be trying to tell me subversively and just enjoy the space opera for what it is. All right, Page Turners, they were not. Holy cow, I blanked on the name of the podcast. My apologies, Brennan Marr. Page Turners, they were not. Friend of the show, Brennan Marr, asks, Hi, John. If you had no choice but to become either a bounty hunter or a smuggler in the Star Wars galaxy, what would you choose and why? Me and my friend of mine were discussing the topic last night, and I said I'd rather be a smuggler, not because I like the idea of transporting illegal substances, but so that I could smuggle supplies to innocent victims trapped behind enemy lines. I would not want to be a bounty hunter, because I don't relish the idea of capturing people for hire if I can't determine if they're guilty of anything worth all that. I wouldn't have a problem capturing bad people, but being a bounty hunter implies that I take the job only based on the word of the employer, and they can't always be trusted. What would you rather choose? I'd rather choose a smuggler for all the reasons that you just mentioned. And not even. Look, I want to look like a bounty hunter, right? But I want to be a smuggler. I think that would be cool. I want to be a combo, because I don't know if I necessarily want a smuggler ship. I mean, like the Millennium Falcon was a smuggler ship, but I think I've kind of would prefer to have sort of my own smaller starfighter to buzz around in than to have a ship that was capable of smuggling, unless it was something like the Millennium Falcon. So maybe if I'm smuggling small items, then I can have a ship. I want everything that goes along with being a bounty hunter, but having the job of being a smuggler. How's that for a cop-out? All right, that wraps the show up for this week. Thank you so much for checking it out. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com is the email address. And again, I want to encourage you, use that promo code, Star Wars, for free shipping at ensorings.com, ENSORings.com. Go pick yourself up for Father's Day or for yourself or the Star Wars fan in your life. A fantastic official Star Wars instant collector's item silicone ring. And also head to Amazon.com if you haven't done it already and pick up your preferred copy of the EMBARK series. Start with EMBARK Book 1 and work your way through the series. Also free on Kindle Unlimited and available in audiobook too. If you have read the stories and enjoyed them and haven't done it yet, leave a review online there at Amazon.com. Search for Jon, Jon Justice. And I'll talk to you guys again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.